everyone. Hi. My name is Kinsey Robb. I am the Executive Director here at Art Center Sarasota. Thank you so much for coming here tonight for our Artist Talk series. We have some of our board members here, Ned Norris, Barbara Banks. I want to also just thank our amazing staff, my colleagues who work around the clock to make these exhibitions happen and to also create the programming here at the Art Center. We're a small but mighty force in the nonprofit visual arts, and we're so thrilled to have everybody here supporting us. So to our curator and our director of exhibitions, Christina Burrell, thank you. Hiding out in the back, Cassie Andrews, who's also is our exhibitions assistant. And we have at the front desk, you might have all been welcomed by Catherine Caesar, who's in charge of our education department. And my colleague, new to our team, Rachel Ploss, who is our donor development officer, who's just joined us in January. Yes. So officially. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you all tonight as we gather to celebrate the remarkable vision and textile artist, author, lecturer, and teacher, Carole Lyles Shaw. Her work has been exhibited nationally and internationally at institutions including, but not limited to, the Ontario, California Museum of Art and History, the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center, the Virginia Quilt Museum, and can be found in the permanent collections of the Rocky Mountain Quilt Museum. Carole's also the co-founder of the Sarasota Modern Quilt Guild, and she served on the board of the Modern Quilt Guild as well. Carole joins us as part of our Exhibiting Artist Talk series, presenting her inspiring work, Black Women, Music of the Heart and Soul. This collection serves as a powerful celebration of women singers and songwriters who have defied genres and have broken through boundaries. Carole's work pays homage to the strength, creativity, spirit, and resilience of these women and demonstrates the transformative power of quilt making as a medium to bridge generations, cultures, and stories. So without further ado, let us extend a warm welcome to Carole, whose artistry and vision continue to inspire us all. Carole, we are thrilled to have you here tonight and look forward to hearing about the stories, inspirations, and artistic journey behind Black Women, Music of the Heart and Soul.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Kinsey, for that warm welcome. And Carole, thank you so much for coming. Your show has just been amazing. And amazingly responded to as well. I thought that it would be great to just start by learning a little bit more about you. I know that many of you know Carole well, but can you just tell us a little bit about how you got into quilt making and what drove you to start?
Sure, and first of all, thank you everybody for turning out. It's just so lovely to see friends, old and new, and Quilt Guild members and just miscellaneous people I scooped up on the street. How I got started. I woke up one morning about 30 years ago, deciding to make something permanent to give to my nieces and nephews. I was living in Baltimore, that's my home. And I had to my knowledge, I had no quilt making tradition in my family. There was an old Singer sewing machine in my grandmother's bedroom for years, but I never saw anybody even touch it. No, I don't still have it. I wish I did. But I just literally woke up one morning with this idea that I would make these kids some quilts. And knowing nothing, I went to the library, as we did back then. Books, magazines, TV shows. Eventually, once I got started fumbling around making some quilts, I met the president of the African American Quilters of Baltimore, Barbara Piatilla, who is not with us anymore, but she was an amazing story quilter and had formed the Guild in Baltimore. And we met at a quilt show, and she literally scooped me up and said, "Come join our guild." So glad I did, because the women in that guild were and still are heirloom level quilt makers. They were making Baltimore album quilts by hand. Those of you who are quilters know what kind of skill that takes. And they insisted that I sit down and learn the fundamentals. And they taught me all the skills, the basic skills that I really needed to successfully bring my ideas to life. Because I started out making traditional quilts, got very bored with that very quickly. Wandered off into art quilting, and they said, well, you can make these strange things you're making, but you need to learn how to sew. And that's how I started. Now, full circle, in Baltimore right now, the African American Quilters of Baltimore have a show at the Maryland Center for Art, no, it's the Maryland Center for History and Culture in Baltimore. They have a show there, and I have a piece in that show. And that piece has photographs of the first generation of my nieces and nephews and me, you know, years and years ago. And those photographs are in that piece, which is hanging in a show in Baltimore. So this is really full circle for me for that piece to be there. So anyway, I get chills when I think about it. So that's how I started. Woke up, and I always say there was an angel sitting on my shoulder. I had dabbled in, you know, painting and printmaking, and, you know, it was all kind of interesting because I loved art. Had always loved and collected, in a small way, art, but never found a medium that spoke to me like textiles do. And I've been in that world ever since.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. So, I mean, historically, for those of you, I'm sure many of you know, quilting is really a practice that draws in a community. Yeah. And I'd love for you just to tell us a little bit about how that cultural influence of that tradition really plays a part in your work. I do know quilt makers who work in many different styles who kind of work in isolation, especially pre-internet, you know, when it was a lot harder. Unless you joined the guild, you might be working alone doing your work. And that's how I started. I was home in my little space trying to figure this thing out. And I am so glad that I was found by AAQB and the other groups that I've joined since then. For many reasons. The learning about, you know, this whole wonderful tradition of quilting and textile art, sharing inspiration, encouraging each other. When I joined AAQB, other than Barbara, who was making story quilts, everybody else was doing fairly traditional work. But I was really lucky because that guild just welcomed my then crazy-looking ideas. And, you know, they were curious and they were supportive and they encouraged me. Unfortunately, not all guilds, not all groups are open to non-traditional ways of working with textiles. I was really lucky. And I believe in the power of community in all aspects of life. Human beings are social animals. When we're isolated, we can go crazy, and we become violent, and we die when we're in isolation. So quilting is one of many forms of working together that sustains people. Here in the US, in the pioneer days, women, and of course in enslavement times, women, primarily women, but not always women, because there were many and still are many male quilters. Women were isolated, especially if they were on farms or, you know,
You know, they didn't have a big community, other than maybe the church, if there was one that they could get to once a month, once every 2 months. So quilting bees were a way for women and men to come together to finish quilts together. You know, you might piece the top at home with no scissors and candlelight. Lord only knows how women made these incredible quilts 150 years ago with no tools and no light and no money. And so coming together for a quilting bee, even today, it sustains you emotionally, psychologically, besides the practical thing of getting a quilt done to go on a bed somewhere. So I work very hard, have always worked very hard at building community wherever I can. And that's why I started a guild when I got here, because I didn't know anybody. My husband didn't know anybody. We just liked the area. So we arrived, and I thought, okay, I need a community. I'll start a guild. And I found a friend here. We didn't know each other. We made friends very quickly, and we started the Sarasota Modern Quilt Guild. So, and in my work, the work that I do that's in this kind of style, especially, for me, is about storytelling, and that's definitely an influence of Barbara Piatilla, because she told a lot of stories in her work. And I believe that by sharing stories through my work, that's another of my efforts at building community, embracing people, and pulling them into my world, essentially. Because I only tell the stories that resonate for me. You know, I'm not out there trying to tell anybody else's stories. So.
Well, I commend you. I mean, you have become a mentor for many quilters. You have workshops, you have lectures, you're an author. It's really amazing.
Thank you.
So are there any specific art movements or artists outside of quilting, in quilting, that you really resonate with?
Absolutely, yeah. The other side of my work life, art life in textiles is pretty geometric, abstract. Some of you who may have been on my website have probably seen some of that work. So it's real different from this. I have two brains. And I work happily in both of them. So my primary influences have always been painters. 20th and now 21st, this is the 21st century, 21st century painters. Starting with Impressionism, because I lived in Baltimore, and for a while I lived in New York City and traveled back and forth. Rich resources with museums and so forth, so I was always able to, you know, take a few hours, go find a museum, a gallery, just walk around, just soak it in, just learn from what the painters were doing. And that's why I thought I was going to be a painter, but that didn't work out. So starting with Impressionism, and then moving all the way forward. I mean, geometric abstraction today is really pulling me in. Not so much Cubism, okay, but you know. But color field painters, and there's so many names that are just popping in my head. Sonia Delaunay it has been a great influence on particularly my abstract work, but also my love of color. Alma Thomas, color field painter who lived and worked in I just went blank. DC, New York, DC, etc. When I was able to go to London on a business trip, I went to the Tate Modern and saw my first Rothko paintings in person. I thought I was going to lose my mind. I mean, I sat there probably for an hour in that room. I couldn't leave. Couldn't leave. And on and on and on. My list is really long. And every day I discover somebody new. Thank you, Instagram. And it's interesting because I walked through the member show a little while ago, and although I am deep into abstraction as, you know, particularly a painting style, the painting that drew me in, and I was telling Christine that I would take home, is by Peter Paris, White Laundry. Before you leave, please go look at that painting. It is stunning. It is stunning. It is so simple. It's traditional in many ways in style. And of all the work in this building, that was the piece I had to come back to and look at again and again. So, you know, it's not about, for me, it's not about finding the people whose work I like and whose work influences my work. It's about learning from all kinds of artists and the way they look at color and the way they tell story and the way they abstract from reality. It's all of it. It's all of a piece to me. And like I said, I was really fortunate that I lived where I lived, had the opportunity to travel and to see the great museums of the world. And wherever I go, if there's something arty going on, I want to see what's happening. You know? Whether it's 1,000 or 2,000 years old or 20 minutes, I don't care. I want to see it all.
That's wonderful. I know anyone that knows you personally can see that holistic approach in your work and in your life, I think. It's really inspiring. You mentioned earlier a little bit about the traditional quilts that you started with, but these are really more what you would call art quilts.
Yes.
So how do you see the art quilts relating to those traditional quilts?
Sure. First of all, fundamentally, all of us who are working with textiles, whether it's for the wall or the bed or both, we are grounded in the way traditional quilts were made. You take some fabric and you cut it up, and then you sew it back together. And you may have a plan for that or not, and you might, you know, whatever. But traditional quilting, there's a misapprehension or misperception, is that the right word, about traditional quilting. Because if you look, there's a great YouTube video by, I think, the Quilt Alliance, and it's a lecture and slideshow about quilts that were made like 125 years or more ago now. And they're old quilts. And you think you're going to see little tiny boxes and everything all lined up neat and perfect. And those quilts, some of them are as contemporary as the work that'll be at the Modern Quilt Guild conference next week. So we think we know what a traditional quilt is, but we really don't until we sit down with somebody who really knows quilt history and can show you the breadth and the creativity that the men and women who were making quilts, you know, in 1893, and not following a set of rules. Those rules didn't really get codified until probably the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and then the resurgence of quilting in the 70s with the centennial, bicentennial, whatever it was. And suddenly there were all these rules about what traditional quilts were supposed to be. And those were promoted by people who did not know quilt history. And I thought they knew what they were talking about until I was exposed to other ideas. So, yeah, it's all of a piece. I was asked recently by a quilter who said, well, there's this term art quilts, and there's modern quilts, and there's traditional quilts. Well, do we need all these? Well, can't they all just be quilts? And I said, absolutely not. And the reason is we need language to describe what we're thinking and what we're seeing. We wouldn't call, I mean, that's a very diverse show out there, the member show. We wouldn't call it, well, we do call it all art, but it's not all one thing. It's many things, many genres, many styles. We need language to help us think and create and be creative and learn the so-called principles or rules. I never met a rule I couldn't break, particularly when it comes to art. But we have to understand that, or it's helpful to understand it, because we need to kind of know where we're coming from, so we don't think, oh my gosh, I just invented, you know, surrealism. You may have done a nice piece, but you didn't invent it. It's just helpful so we don't embarrass ourselves.
Well, so you actually, all the work in this show, you call them spirit portraits.
Yes.
And I think that's a perfect name for them, but can you tell us a little bit about how that came about?
Sure. What's the real answer? I'm going to get the real. I am not a skillful. I am not skilled at drawing realistic portraits. Took a couple classes. Didn't go well. It wasn't something I was going to spend time learning to do. And then I had an idea several years ago that I wanted to make a quilt that would capture the essence of my mother. Although I didn't name it after her, I gave it a more generic name. And I wanted it to be a portrait, but not of her face, because I've got a photograph for that. I wanted it to be a portrait of the context of who she was, the kind of person she was. And that's what started me on the road of making these kinds of works. Because I made a silhouetted figure, like I did with these pieces, and it was, then I created the chair she was sitting in, and the wallpaper, and just the surroundings, some jewelry that I attached to her, some lace doilies are in that piece. So it was really telling a story about her as an individual. And that I got very excited about it. I saw the possibilities, that I wasn't limited by the fact that I couldn't draw and, you know, couldn't make a face. And I didn't want it to look cartoonish. I wanted really the context, the story, to be what that piece was about. So I did that one, and then I did a couple more, and then I did a couple more, and I thought, oh, this is cool. And then I got distracted and did other things along the way. But every once in a while, I'd always come back to that way of working. And I have at least 30 more in my head that may or may not get made. Some will get made. Some will definitely get made this year. But so it's the spirit of the person. And I don't call them soul portraits, because the word soul has so many other connotations. Well, so does spirit, and I didn't want to call them contextual portraits. That seemed too academic-y. So that's where I am. I'm working on a new one right now that's almost done. That is inspired by a book by Octavia Butler. She's an Afrofuturist sci-fi writer. It's based on one of her earliest books called Dawn, and it's the story of a woman and aliens and whatever. But it's about the rebirth, the potential rebirth of humanity and the earth after a disaster. And that piece is also a spirit portrait. And I did something very different. For these, you know, I did a lot of research and reading and, you know, listened to some music. But for that piece, I had read the book and vaguely remembered it, so I downloaded the audiobook, bought the audiobook. So I started listening to it as I was starting to make that piece. And so as I'm listening to the book, because it's a fast read, it was influencing what was going into the piece. And I've never had that exact experience. I mean, I know Elizabeth Cotton's songs, and I was listening to a little of her music, some blues music, and some opera. So there was a little bit of oral context for some of these pieces, but to listen to that book and build this Afrofuturist spirit portrait of the central character in that book was a revelation. And I'm going to do another one. And I'm going to pick up another one of her books and do some more.
That's awesome. I can't wait to see that one.
It's on my Instagram.
Full of color, I imagine.
It is. Actually, it's. You have to look at it. Yes or no?
Well, so, I mean, how do you go about picking these detailed fabrics and the embellishments that you put on each of these pieces to really bring out that spirit of the individual? It's important to me to have congruency, consistency, thematic consistency, which translates to the type of fabrics, textures, colors. So for the pieces that are more historical, I wanted more of an antique look, like the piece on the end there, and the opera piece, a little bit with the cotton piece too. But when it came to Ella Fitzgerald, I wanted something more contemporary. So that jazz piece there for her garden. So it's based on my research. I do not have a huge stash of fabric anymore. When we moved here to Florida and I discovered tiny house, small rooms, no basement, and my Maryland friend said, "Why aren't there any basements?" I said, "Because if we had basements, there'd be alligators in it. This is a swamp. We're sitting on water." And, you know, no attics. So I destashed. I got rid of a lot of stuff. I was a hoarder, I'll be honest with you, with fabric. But I kept certain things that were special, and I acquire thoughtfully now, and very deliberately. For these pieces, I bought very little fabric. The embellishments are bridal lace, some of them. I didn't even know what to ask for. I finally figured out what I needed, because I'm not going to embroider anything with sequins. So the opera piece has some bridal lace on it, and so does Victoria Spivey here. As well as, of course, the Ankara fabrics, the African fabrics. So it has to be consistent with the time period and the life of that individual. So historically, you know, I'm looking for fabrics that are congruent. Makes sense visually. Absolutely, it makes tons of sense. But I love that you're presenting these historical figures in a contemporary light, and you're uplifting them.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part of your work conceptually. So why is that, you know, uplifting so important for you?
Well, when Christina and I started talking about the show, I thought, what do I want to do? Do I want to go abstract, or do I want to go spirit portrait, or the celebration quilts, which is a whole other thing? And then I decided, I want to do these. I want to do this. And then the idea of women in different musical genres who, for the most part, are very obscured now. You know, Ms. Price's work was almost lost completely, as you saw in the write-up, and by accident, her manuscripts were discovered before they were thrown in a dumpster. Yeah. Of course, everyone knows Ella Fitzgerald. She's the most well-known of the folks in this room. And so then I thought, well, who was the first? Fill in the blank. Who was the first woman who wrote early blues songs? And that led me down the Wikipedia rabbit hole to Victoria Spivey. And then I discovered not only was she singing, she was writing, she was a music publisher, she had a company, you know, putting out records. So there was a richness to all the aspects of her life. And I thought, oh, she's cool. And then the title of the first piece, Black Snake Blues, and oh, yeah, baby. Alberta Hunter, I've known about Alberta Hunter when she was rediscovered after not making any music for many, many years of her adult life. So as I thought about, okay, who cafe singer, kind of early jazzy, bluesy, Alberta Hunter, of course, so did some research there. I was looking for early Black opera singers, and the person I thought I was going to do is not the person I ended up doing. I ended up doing a piece for Katerina, who is really not known at all. And that piece, when I started pulling the fabrics, it was going to be about somebody else. And I went back and looked at the notes, and I had a virtual assistant do a little homework for me and pull together a lot of notes. And when I looked at her life story, I thought, no, I'm going to start with her. Start with Katerina. So there were people, these are women whose stories appeal to me. I'm not even sure how I found Lillian Harden Armstrong. I honestly don't know how I found her, honestly. It was just serendipity when I discovered her story and the role she played in Louis Armstrong's life. MC Sharrock, I was sitting watching Netflix, and up comes the documentary about women in hip hop, the queens of hip hop. And she was one of the first people in the first episode, and I thought, who's she? So I had to go research her, and found her, and I thought, that piece of fabric traveled with me, the outside piece, the graffiti piece, traveled with me from Baltimore. I probably had that fabric 20 years, or something like that. Never could get rid of it and never could use it. Just kept, get packed and then unpacked. But it was perfect for her, and every piece of it is in that quilt. It's all gone now. So yeah, some of these stories I knew about, some I stumbled across, some my assistant, when I gave her the prompt, who was the first? XYZ, XYZ. And she would find 2 or 3 people. And just compiled this document for me, and then I dug down into the stories. So I had a little help. Thank you, Alyssa.
That's awesome. I know we have a lot of quilt makers here in the room tonight. So for their benefit, and everyone else's as well, I was hoping you could share a few of your tricks that you have employed in creating these beautiful quilts.
Sure. One of them is some of, particularly the embellishment type fabrics, like in the Alberta Hunter piece, her dress and hat. That fabric is cut out from a dress that I bought at a thrift shop. Wow. Because I don't do, hand things like crocheting. I don't do that. So I have to go buy that stuff, and I'm too cheap to buy it, full price at Joann's. When I may cut it up and hate it and throw it away because it didn't work in the piece. So I thrift shop a little bit. I don't thrift shop a lot. A little bit of eBay for some of the lace, the bridal lace. So yeah, unconventional sources is one tip.
What about the words?
Oh yes.
Because there are words in a lot of these.
Yes. Some of them, like in the Price piece, a little bit in this piece, the Freight Train lyrics, where else? I think those are the only words. But I print, I scan documents or create it in Word or whatever, some program, then print it on fabric. These words were tea-dyed with tea, like tea bags, tea-dyed, to get that antique look to it. I also look for fabrics that have words in them, like the jazz fabric there. And the fabric in the Alberta Hunter piece has words in it too, Cafe Society, which was perfect for her. And I pulled that out of my stash. I don't even know why I bought that fabric. It's really not my style, but it was in my music fabric bin. So I collect a little bit of thematic fabric. I don't collect a lot of it. I might have 2 or 3 yards of something, a yard of something. Then I use it and move on, because they're always going to print something new. So some words I print at home, and some is in the fabric. The opera I cut out on a cutter machine. You know, yeah. And the jazz letters, I think I cut those out by hand, actually. Sometimes I'll do that.
I remember when I came for my studio visit, I was so impressed with the historical writings on the pieces. They're just fascinating. I love that you dye them with tea. It's perfect.
Yeah. I don't do much, I don't do any dyeing, like the dye dyes. That's too much work. Occasionally I have painted on fabric, but not for any of these pieces. But mostly I can find what I need, especially now these days. 20 years ago when I started doing this, I was having trouble finding fabrics. The Katerina opera piece, the border, that brown border, that's actually some sort of upholstery fabric. And the background behind her is upholstery fabric. So I look for textures.
So I know you were hoping to talk just a little bit about one of these pieces specifically. And so the Elizabeth Cotton over here, folk song composer and performer, is the perfect one.
In many ways, because when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I actually played guitar, performed in coffee houses like we did back then. I was a true hippie, I can still remember my grandmother's shock when I came home and I had stopped straightening my hair. Yeah, baby. And I worked real jobs still. I'm still making a living. She was not convinced I would be able to with my hair like that. But we persevered. So anyway, and I still own the guitar that I had. And I don't play anymore, but I may go back to it one day. But anyway, I just knew about her. I knew about Elizabeth Cotton, and she was seminal in many ways. She was a left-handed guitarist, and she invented a style of guitar playing, folk music guitar playing, called cotton picking. And many guitarists to this day still use that style, especially in folk music. And her seminal, the song she's best known for is called Freight Train. And I happen to have some train fabrics in my stash, like tickets and so forth. At the opening, someone asked me, "Did you print all those? Did you have a stash of old tickets?" I said, "Oh, no, that's fabric I bought." But, and the other fabric that's in here that's kind of fun has the word story and journey and those kind of words in the fabric, so that I've used both of those. Her dress is also from a thrift shop. That's in thrift shop, is it? And some upholstery fabric is in there, and, you know. In fact, the neck of the guitar is from the same fabric that's around the opera piece. Right. Yeah, and it was perfect for the frets and so forth. I have to figure that out. It was already in the fabric. So this piece means a lot to me because it takes me back to my you know, hippie days. My mother bought the guitar for me back at a time when we had very little money. To this day, I never figured out how she did it, but she figured out how to buy me that guitar that I wanted, and that's very special too. So this piece does mean a lot to me. I can still hear the song in my head now, and my fingers run. So,
well, before we open the floor up to some Q&A, which I'm sure you guys have tons of questions for Carole, I just want to congratulate you on this amazing body of work. It's truly you. Just so many visitors that are taken by the technical prowess that you're presenting, but also the color and the feeling that you're emanating from all these works. So I would just like to ask in my final question, what are you hoping that we as the viewer take from this work?
It's important to know our history. It's important to preserve it, and it's especially important to communicate it in whatever form, process you have open to you. And that there are no boundaries. You know, there are really no boundaries. We impose boundaries on ourselves in our life, you know, whether or not we're artists or quilters or whatever, but you know, just think about what you're limiting yourself, what you're keeping yourself from doing. When if you just said, maybe I'll just find some thrifted fabric and I'll put it up on the wall and then I'll see what happens. What story do you want to tell? And who will you tell them to? Like my piece in Baltimore is really important. In fact, I have 3 sisters, and one of my sisters, I sent the photo to our family chat, and she looked at the photo and she said, so when it comes down, it's coming home with me, right? I said, well, get out your checkbook. It probably will come. It'll go home with somebody in Baltimore, I'm sure. One of them. They'll fight over it. Questions?
Yes, thank you so much, Carole. That's amazing.
So, being a quilter, I want to ask, from this concept, it sounds like you did one of your mother first, if I recall right.
Yeah.
How long did this collection take to evolve? Because it's amazing.
Well, except for that piece, they were all made last year.
Wow.
Yeah. In about 6 months, although Christine thought I was working before that. It was about 6 months.
Wow.
Of intense, it was intense. It was intense. Yes, ma'am.
I know that a lot of these entertainers that you made were old and passed away years ago. Did you ever meet any of these people that you portray?
That's a good question. No. No.
So this was all from video or pictures or just from your lives?
Yeah, reading about their lives.
Yes.
Photos of them, you know, and many of them, there are videos of them performing,
Right.
you know, but some not.
Because I noticed that they've all passed away except for
Shara.
Yeah.
Sharon, yeah.
So I was just wondering. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, in fact, I was not going to do a very contemporary piece until I sat down and saw that Netflix documentary. And I'm not a big hip hop fan of hip hop. I mean, I know about it like we all do, but her story just captured me, because when I was thinking about, well, if I do a contemporary person, it'll probably be Queen Latifah, because I admire everything about her. And someday I may do a Queen Latifah piece, but her story, because she was the first and she was young. I mean, she was a child almost, and in a very misogynistic world. But she persevered, and there were many after her, but she was the first. So I was looking for people who,
Breaking ground.
yeah, pioneered, persevered, did things their own way.
All of these are absolutely amazing, but I am a huge fan of your fractured work. And I want to know if you're buying a lot of ombre fabrics, because it looks like the way the shading on some of them are very ombre.
I do use ombres. There's ombre fabric in Ella's garden. And, oh yeah, and this piece too. Yeah, I forgot about this piece, yeah. Yeah, ombre means it's a fabric that shades through different colors or values of the same color, like the light into the dark. This is all one piece of fabric behind her. That's one piece of fabric in the background of the jazz piece. And I love that type of fabric because, you know, you get such movement right in the fabric itself.
Yeah.
So,
Tell me a little bit about your process of how you create the layouts and the design. Do you work from sketches? I'm interested in the silhouettes. You know, some are side views, some are frontal. How do you go about doing that?
I work mostly on the design wall. I sometimes do a really basic, loose idea sketch. I think I did a sketch for this piece because I knew I wanted to emphasize the title of the song. So I did that. And I had started looking at a number of artists, painters, who also work with silhouettes, kind of. Not a lot of representation in their portraits. And I had been looking at those, and one of the things that struck me was that they weren't all face on. You know, like the Caterina piece is just face on, the Ella Fitzgerald piece is face on. Some of them, the MC Shaw, that silhouette actually comes partly from a photograph I took of one of my sisters years ago. And she was kind of standing, you know, I had this funny angle of this photo I took of her. But then when I thought about some of the photos and a little bit of video I saw of Shaw Rock, she had a lot of attitude. And so I was trying to capture a little of that stance in that piece. But most of them are front on. I'll probably do a few more like this though with the features. I kind of like that with this one. So we'll see. But I don't sketch full. I might get started, start throwing pieces up on the wall. I usually put the silhouette on early because that gives me the scale of the piece. Sometimes the silhouette has to be cut down or I need a bigger one, so I have to make another one. Yeah, and then sometimes I'll stop and do a little sketch thinking before I can go to the next step, if you will. Yeah. I'm sorry, there's a hand back here and then I'll come over here.
I actually have two separate questions. One is really quick, and then the other is about your process, and these are just amazing. One is, you talked about the importance of language, and from a history standpoint, I'm really interested in where you place the women of East Bend and, you know, traditional versus modern. But the other question is about your process, and I'm thinking about the quilting as opposed to the actual images. I have some quilters in my family, and I was amazed to learn that sometimes they hand it over to someone else to actually do it. And so I'm just really interested in the patterns that you used in these backgrounds, the quilting patterns, and how you come about deciding what kinds of patterns and textures to create the quilting process?
For these pieces, I quilted all of these myself. Sometimes I do send some of my other kinds of work out to be, for that final quilting stitching, to be done by a long arm person that we figure out what we're gonna do with that. But these I did myself because the quilting stitches on these types of pieces are integral to the design. The color of the thread I use, the color changes, and I call this my eccentric quilting because it is not, straight lines going this way, a regular kind of pattern. It's very improvisational, and it is planned. It's not accidental at all. Well, there are some accidents, but it's a planned approach. Was that the question about process?
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely. The second question was really about history.
The G's Bend. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, there is a place in Alabama, a very isolated black community called G's or Gee's Bend. And 30 years ago, 25 years ago, a guy stumbled through this little community and saw these quilts hanging on the line by a very impoverished group of black quilters, most of them women. I'm not sure if there were any men in the early group, but and was just stunned by the artistic vision in these improvisational quilts that were made with very poor materials, they had minimal access to everything, because they were very poor. This was a community that had no paved roads at the time. I'm not sure they do yet. I think they have some. But anyway, he discovered them, bought a bunch of their work, wrote a couple books. Some of the quilts ended up in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Was that the first show?
Houston, and then Whitney too.
I'm sorry?
Whitney was the
At the Whitney was the first show. Okay. And they were hung as art on the wall, and most of that work in that show was fairly big quilts, bigger than these pieces. And the art world lost their minds because they could not figure out how these relatively uneducated women had this artistic vision, and it looked like contemporary modern painting. And so, where you have to come out on this is human brains are human brains, and there's certain things human brains are going to do, regardless of where you are in the world and what medium you're working with. There's some forms and symbols that are simply universal. But at any rate, so that started a furore, as the British would say, in the art world and in the quilt world, because quilters had never seen anything like this, for the most part. Their work has influenced a lot of people. Not me, and in the sense that I was already doing a lot of improvisational work, and I was influenced by art. So I had come around to the same place they ended up, but on a different path. Fascinating. They were exploited. They didn't get very much money initially. They lost rights to some things. That is no longer true. They are very much empowered, very much in charge of everything. Now they have this licensing deal with Target where you can buy these knockoff quilts, But you can also buy their work custom. You can still buy their work custom, and they teach. They're a fascinating group of women. They came to Baltimore several years ago, and my guild and another group hosted them, and we got to just spend an afternoon. We weren't taking a workshop or anything. We were just hanging and talking, and they're just very thoughtful. They were astounded, frankly, at the beginning at the reception from the fine art world to their work. Now, the misconception about them is that the improvisational work that they are best known for is what they were all doing, and that's not the case. They were actually making patterned traditional quilts. But those were not the quilts that, what's his face, I forget his name, wanted. He wanted the improv pieces that, of course, you know, changed a lot of quilters' lives as they began to see them.
What was the name of that group or the person?
It's GEE''S Bend. B as in boy, END as in David. G's Bend. If you just Google that, a whole bunch of stuff will pop up. They've even, the U.S. government even did a set of stamps with their quilts on there.
Hi, I spent 51 years in Baltimore. So, I have about 3 quick questions. One is, I belong to a Sarasota Association for the study of African American life and history, and my job was to find someone to give us a moment in history. So I called my friend Leslie King Hammond.
Yeah.
I'm sure you know her.
Yeah.
And she said, "Okay, Harold, here you come again." But she identified. She said, "Look, I was contacted by the producers of what have you of the movie Kindred."
Yes.
And she said, and what we did was, I thought, and then I went to this guild. Was it
African American Quilters of Baltimore.
Wow.
Those are my people.
So all of the quilts were acting as prompts of the period.
I have 2 blocks in those quilts.
Whoa!
The producers of the TV show Kindred contacted Leslie King Hammond, Dr. Leslie King Hammond, in Baltimore.
Another Octavia Butler.
Yes. Exactly. Now, my second question is Barbara Pietro, is that Ontario Pietro's
Yes.
wife?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Always at the Artscape, yeah.
Yes.
And was Joyce Scott a part of the quilting group?
No. She's a friend of the guild.
Oh, okay.
She and in fact the show that my guild has up now is part of a year-long celebration by several institutions of Elizabeth Talford Scott, who is an African-American textile artist who works in the fiber tradition. Her daughter, Joyce Scott, is also an artist, multimedia, jewelry and sculpture and textile. So Elizabeth Talford Scott has passed on, but several institutions have her work on exhibit and their events, and this show that we have our quilts in is part of that, I think, a year-long celebration of her. So we know all the same people. And my aunt, Helen Lyles Gray, was a member of ASALA for years and years and years. In Baltimore.
The next question is, what high school did you go to?
Forest Park.
What? Did you really?
That's a joke of Baltimore. They didn't ask what college. The person said, what school you were at?
Right. Yes, ma'am.
And also a native Baltimorean.
Yes, another one in the house.
With all of the detail that I'm looking at and the history that you researched and finding the fabrics, and did I hear you say you did these in 1 year?
6 months. Actually, less than 1 year.
So when you started on a quilt, did you finish that quilt before going on to the next one?
That's a great question, and usually yes and no. I had several of them kind of in mind, what I was going to do. I knew one was going to be about opera, that was going to be about somebody else, but it ended up being Katerina. I knew there would be at least one jazz. Alberta Hunter came to me a little later. I found her, so I had the ideas kind of in my head, kind of in a stack. So I have project bins, plastic bins, small plastic bins, and because all these are in my head, and I've started sketching and making notes and whatever, I would see a piece of fabric and think, oh, that might go in the Alberta Hunter piece. So I'd throw it in that bin. Well, I was collecting my glue Ankara fabrics, so I would have a stack of them because it had to be a blue piece because it's about blues, right? You know, no brainer there. So I would just start collecting the materials sort of simultaneously, but then when it was time to work on a piece, I have to dive into that piece. Now, what I was also doing was making some abstract pieces for another thing. So occasionally I would break away from making one of these pieces to make a pure abstract piece and then come back, you know. Kind of a head cleanser. And some took longer than others. The one that took the longest time was actually the opera piece. I couldn't finish it. I don't know what was happening. I actually put that one to the side and started something else. And that one came together real quick. Shara was fast because I knew exactly what that was going to be.
So how many hours a day do you spend quilting?
Anywhere from none to 4 or 5 hours at most, because I'm up and down, standing a lot. I stand to work. I sit to sew, but I'm standing in front of my cutting mat and the board and my design wall. So it's hard on my knees, my legs. So I can only do a high number of hours so many days in a row, and then I got to take a day off. So I don't have a schedule. I'm not. I know some artists who have a strict work schedule. They're there at 9:15 and they work till noon and then they have lunch and then they, oh, no.
So what applique technique do you use? Are you fusing?
It's, for the quilters in the room, it's all fused and machine applique. I don't do much handwork anymore. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to make a statement. I made a quilt of my husband's hats. He was in the military. And all of his Vietnam hats he wore, I put it on. I didn't think about a story. So now I'm impressed that I came up with a story to create this quilt, and it will be in the county fair. The ladies will be picking it up on the 4th. She got the paper today, and it will be displayed at the county fair.
The Manatee County Fair?
No.
Sarasota County Fair.
It's not the county fair. Like, it's a beginner type look.
I remember you brought early. She's in this. I'm sorry if I forgot your name. I'm so
Sisters
Ophelia is in a group that Linda and a couple of others of us are in, and she brought her piece when she was starting, you know, looking for help. And this is the community piece. We said, okay, here's how you do this. Here's how you do that. No, don't do it that way. Do it this way. This is easier.
And I have the rod on it to hang, but I also attached a ribbon-like thing to hang it on. But I'm going to see if they need it. If they don't, I'm taking it off for the way I see you.
Yeah, there's a sleeve on that.
It's in a rod, and since she's not going to get it now until the 4th, I'm going to put some more stuff on it.
That's the way to go. And that's actually, you would love the work of Elizabeth Telford Scott, because her work reminds me of what you're doing. Yeah.
Elizabeth Scott.
Yeah. Next time we meet, I'll make sure I print something out so you can see it. Yes.
So, when you have an idea that you're going to do a certain character from a certain time, and the result could be any. I mean, there's so many ways to go.
Yeah.
And these all seem like inevitable conclusions. Like this has this has to be this way.
Yeah.
Or Ella, that's Ella. You know, kind of the synthesis of Ella. So when you have your boxes and you're putting the fabric in, you know, what is it that kind of makes you feel the opera piece? No, I mean, it's so dramatic. It's black and white, and then the flurry of her dress. It's kind of a, you know,
Diva.
Diva.
Yeah.
But I just wonder how you kind of come to what feels inevitable.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me that you said that, because that's when I get to that place, my gut tells me it's done. It's done. Stop. It's fine. Move on, because I can just, you know, go around in my head forever on a piece if I'm not careful.
Because I was trying to figure it out, and this one, for example, I was thinking maybe the colors of the guitar were what, you know, those tonalities of warm browns and might have been somehow instrumental in. Oh, no pun intended. Oh, God.
Oh, you know, when I think about her music, the stories in her music, they are softer. They are about longing and loss of home and belonging, but in a different way than Victoria Spivey's hard-ass blues. You know, this is, you know, juke joint stuff.
Yeah.
You know, this is hard
This is
music.
more front porch.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. This is folk music. This is gut bucket blues, as my mother would say. And so the color schemes had to be very different. I mean, I started to go black and blue with this piece, and then decided blue was enough. And I audition and I edit out. You know, I have my little box of stuff, and I try this, I pin that up. I take a lot of photographs in process. I sleep on it, leave it, you know, go have a glass of wine that evening. Don't think about, try not to think about it. And I may leave it for 3 days and then come back to it and know that the decision I made about the lace-like embellishments that was the right decision for that piece. I was thinking I needed something more dramatic, and I decided not to. I wanted something softer. I just wanted it. I wanted to add a touch of elegance to an otherwise sort of more rough-hewn texture. And some people say, well, that's intuitive. No, this is intentional. I'm thinking this stuff. And sometimes something will just land on my cutting table, and I'm like, oh yeah, that is the right piece of fabric. Every once in a while there's an accident, and I'll take advantage of it. There was a hand, I think, in the back.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the framing you did on the opera piece, because the framing is so dramatic. And what were you thinking about when you chose that?
Actually, I was thinking about the curtains in an opera house. You know, that I was kind of going for that, and I actually had some different fabric that I was going to use, but then it didn't work. That fabric, though, was hell to work with. It raveled, and it would lay flat, and it just drove me crazy. But it was the right fabric, and I said, I just got to work with it. And it's not, you know, perfectly symmetrical. You know, I didn't want total symmetry. So the way I cut it, there's some asymmetry in the two, the right and left borders. And I guess that's what I was thinking about. And then as I looked at it later, I thought, it looks like a framed portrait.
Yeah.
You know, a wooden
so frame that she was so, we missed her, right? It's hard to find her, and there she is, framed as a portrait, and it's sort of, I wasn't sure if that's what you were going for, but that's what comes across.
Yeah, not originally. I was more thinking about curtains in an opera house is where I kind of started, but then it just felt like the right fabric, and the flowery fabric is also old fabric from my stash.
I think it's actually sort of like a proscenium, and the character is appearing. It's almost three-dimensional, so that she's emerging onto the stage.
Really, it's fantastic.
Thank you. Oh, it worked.
Well, thank you all so much for coming.